Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. My name is Brett, and we're here again with John Vervaeke. Thanks for being here, John.
Always a pleasure, Brett. Always a pleasure to be here.
So we've got a whole bunch of people here today. Let's jump right into the questions. C. Sepentio can't be here tonight, but he'd like me to read his question. I am doing my bachelor on physics, and whenever I listen to you, a question always occurs to me. What are the ontological statuses of the abstract ideas you are talking about, such as the existential states as love, or other notions such as the imaginal, future or past self, or especially truth, good, and beauty, etc.? As we deconstructed these ideas after the Enlightenment, what appeared as some would call it a kind of nothing buttery, that these are just projections or folk psychology. These are important notions for me, and I feel they are definitely existing, but how to incorporate these into our ontology? Does it have to do with emergence or non-reductivity? Or could you recommend any books on the issue? I hope you understand my question. Thank you very much.
I do understand your question, and yeah. So what you call nothing buttery, which I like. That's kind of cool. It sounds like a pastry. Um, what I would say about that is, yeah, that strikes me as a kind of, in the epistemological domain, it strikes me as a kind of foundationalism, the claim that sort of all of our knowledge sits on our knowledge of physics and is dependent on it, and that project to try and make that case was pursued by the logical positivists, and it's generally regarded to have completely failed. So epistemologically, that's very hard claim to justify. And then over into ontology, it would sound like reductionism, and reductionism is exactly that. And the problem with there's many problems with reduction. One of the problems with reductionism I have an argument around it that it's ultimately self-refuting, and it also has an inconsistent ontology, because first of all it says things like, well, all of these ideas are false ideas and illusions, but then when it's committed to saying that the state of illusion and falsity, these are also mental states, but they're illusions. So the illusion is itself is an illusion, and you get into this infinite regress. And where is the illusion, right, of these upper level things existing actually housed? And that goes to this, and that converges with this argument, which is, right, the fundamental particles and are identical. And yet we have all of this difference that's around us. And that's, of course, the idea of emergence. But why does this relate to science? Well, if science is making use of the informational patterns that are generated at this level, science faces this problem. If all of those entities, like the microscope that the scientist is using and the pencil that they're using to write things down, and even the gas chamber chart to track the subatomic particle, right, and the computers that are recording it, and all of that's illusory, and all the patterns that you're picking up are ultimately illusory, how can you possibly, on the basis of all those illusory patterns, all those illusory processes, all those illusory machines, draw conclusions, real knowledge about what's going on at the level of the fundamental physics? And it's like, oh wait, if the stuff we're pointing to in our fundamental physics, pointing down to quantum and up to relativity, is real, then the thing we use to point, I mean to point in the sense of doing, acquiring knowledge and making theoretical claims, the thing that points to it also has to be, in some deep sense, real. Now our theories can be mistaken, but I'm talking about the status of the entity of theories and thoughts and ideas and propositions. And you can see this going the other way. Well, nothing's real, but, well, you end up, the only place you stop is, so the only level that's real is whatever the bottom level is. And what kind of argument do you make for that being the bottom level well, you'd have to make an argument that everything else is explainable from that bottom level. I don't see that. And secondly, the bottom level turns out to be very abstract. It's, something like probability wave distributions, right, et cetera, et cetera. And like, is that really all that's real? So there's a host, I think these are just devastating arguments against foundationalism and reductionism. And then, and then you just have the observed facts about, emergence, that hydrogen is a gas and oxygen is a gas, right? But, H2O is water and has new properties that behaves in ways that hydrogen and oxygen don't on their own. So with the combination of emergence, the collapse of foundationalism, and I think the incoherence, and I think that's what it really is, the incoherence of reductionism, I think any attempt to use physics as a way of saying, well, there's nothing but, is ultimately incoherent and self-refuting. Now, what that means is it doesn't mean we leap into the arms of supernaturalism or we leap into multiple dualisms or something strange like that. It means we have to think seriously and hard about what a non-reductive physicalism means. Part of that is to not automatically and knee-jerk equate non-reductive physicalism with 18th or even 17th century materialism. I mean, physicalism doesn't hold that all that exists is matter. That's what materialism holds. Neither does it hold that the matter that exists is an inert substance of pure extension. Where does that exist in physics? Right? So the idea that all there is inert matter is not a proper part of physics. Physics has, an inherently dynamic, self-organizing matter. There are forces, there are fields, there's space and time, there's relativity, there's entanglement, there's all kinds of there's potential energy, right? There's kinetic energy. There's all kinds of real relations, real entities that are beyond the level of matter. So we need to get very clear about what it is we're talking about. I think when people accuse me, for example, of, he's just a materialist, I don't know what that for me, that's a straw man, boogeyman. I don't know anybody. I mean, I think people sometimes incorrectly self-designate who's a materialist. I don't know what that even means anymore. I mean, I think evolution is real, and I don't think evolution is made out of matter. Is it a real process and a real relationship between material things? Yes, but that doesn't mean that everything is inert matter. In fact, what would that possibly mean for the evolution of living things? So I think the idea that we can somehow use physics and the success of physics as a way of dismissing everything above the lowest possible level that physics talks about, I think that's ultimately, like I said, incoherent. Once we move to a non-reductive physicalism, we should abandon equating that with 17th century materialism, and we should start talking about dynamical systems, right? We should start talking about all the other entities I've already mentioned, and more and beyond. We should talk about the hyper objects of evolution. We should talk about the hyper objects of plate tectonic motion, right? And so all kinds of things like that have to be a proper part of our ontology. So, yeah, I think the idea that there are not just epistemological, but ontological levels to reality, I think that is a very viable position. And it's one I argue for, and I strongly argue against reductive materialism, because, again, foundationalism and reductionism have both collapsed. Materialism, as far as I can tell, doesn't exist anymore. And so I'm not quite sure what it is I'm being accused of, if people were accusing me, I should say. Instead, what I think we should do is try and see how far we can enrich our ontology so that we can properly home the kind of things we want to talk about in this community.
Well, that's a great answer. And it brings to mind actually a question I've had since listening to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis on you talk a lot about trying to connect with reality, but is there a difference between connecting with reality or connecting with our perception of reality? That we don't have. Do you think we have direct access to reality, or we're perceiving reality through our senses, and we're trying to get our best approximation of what reality is?
Well, I mean, the problem with that is, and that's the Kantian problem about that formulation. And I understand where it comes from. I'm not being dismissive at all. I'm being responsive, I hope. It is, you get the idea that if it's any way, if our information is any way partial, then it's somehow false. And of course, this is the argument that Hegel made against Kant, right? Because Kant's idea was, well, all we get is our experience of the object, and we never know the object, the thing in itself, as he put it. And then Hegel rightly said, well, if there's no possible way of having any knowledge about the thing in itself, then it doesn't exist. And then you actually lose realism. You're into a very strong form of idealism. So if you're committed to realism, then you're committed to this possibility that partial knowledge is in fact real knowledge, even though it isn't complete or completely true. So you have to give up certainty as the measure of reality. Now, here's why you should adopt partial knowledge, because if you don't adopt the possibility of partial real knowledge, you'll face Meno's paradox. This is the famous paradox in Plato, right? Well, if you don't know something, then you couldn't possibly recognize it when you see it, so there's no point looking. And if you know it so you could look for it, then there's no need to look for it. So there's never any learning. This is Meno's paradox. And what the implicit assumption in Meno's paradox is, there's nothing like partial knowledge, because partial knowledge explains both why we need to look, but how we are partially guided in the looking. That's how you get out of Meno's paradox. And you got to get out of Meno's paradox, or you're locked into a very powerful form of skepticism. So I would say if you sort of reject skepticism and you're committed to partial knowledge, and then partial knowledge says, yes, we are filtering information from the environment, that doesn't mean, right, that we are out of touch. What would it mean? What would the opposite mean? What would it mean to touch the environment? Well, what you're implicitly saying is, I'm not really in contact with the world unless my senses it could completely contact every aspect of everything. No object completely contact. That would mean that there's no real interactions between objects either, even out there in the physical world. You have to allow for the real possibility of real relations that involve real partial interaction. And for us, one of a species of real partial interaction is real partial knowledge. So I think we have partial knowledge that is true in part. And that means we should give up that, well, unless we know it for sure, it's somehow an illusion or just how we're perceiving things. If there was no truth in your perception of the world, then there would be no possibility for you correcting the way in which your perceptions are illusory or misleading about the world. So there has to be some way in which the world and your mind do directly interact, and you do have true knowledge about the world. That's how I would answer that.
And I've long sort of said that this is the solution to Hume's the problem of induction.
Yes.
Induction is only a problem if you expect certainty. If you
Yes.
drop the requirement for certainty, then induction is not a problem. You for the vast majority of things we don't need certainty, but then you have to add in the possibility of error. So the question becomes, how do we know that we've figured out what is real? So especially when we're talking about things like altered states of consciousness and when we change our frame and we see new patterns, how do we know we've identified a real pattern versus another mistaken pattern?
Well, first of all, I proposed that what we do, we replace standards of certainty with standards of plausibility, and I've tried to argue give an account of how I think plausibility works. And then we also have replaced certainty with probability. And I think when we have highly probabilistic plausibility, that's what we should commit ourselves to. So I'm giving an argument for pragmatism on the understanding that we also have a plausibly probable process of self-correction. So we have a plausibly probable process of self-correction that's right now helping us to get probably plausible accounts of the world, and we should go with those precisely because they are probable and plausible, and they are being produced by a process of self-correction that is probable and plausible. And then you say, well, what degree of plausibility? And this is where I go with pragmatists more like James than I do with Peirce. I think we're talking about a plausibility that is as comprehensive, you're right, that as possible. That's why I think we have to pursue the answer to your question all the way up to our worldview and all the way down to the moment by moment behaviors of our individual lives. And so that's the standard that I propose that we hold ourselves to. And what I actually would want to say more strongly is I think that's what people are by and large doing already most of the time. We have just been trying to do this impossible Cartesian, often foundationalist, often reductionist project that just doesn't work. And there's good reasons why it'll never work. So in that sense, if I'm what you would call a probabilistic plausibility pragmatist about the answer to that question.
I love that because it not only does it represent my view, it represents it much better than I could state it. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for saying that, Brad.
Thank you. Vinny, you've got a question for John.
Hello?
Yeah,
Hey,
yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. Thanks again, John, for doing this. And yeah, I just wanted to say that been helping some of my friends and stuff go through the core four and stuff like. We're on to the fourth of meditating with Vervaeke, and it's been a real experience. I'm very grateful that you did those videos. So just wanted to thank you especially for that.
Well, thank you for thanking me. I'm also going to pass on the thanks to Amar and Jason because they were really integral to making that happen, and also to Mark and Brett. They were on there in the Sangha and really helping to build a community there. So there's a lot of people that contributed to that making something that you find helpful.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks to everyone involved. So my question is a tad more profane in a sense than what you guys were just talking about. It's the question of essentially politics, but not actually a particular politic, rather like the sort of framing of so like I want to kind of borrow some of your language from the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis episode 13, where you talked about like relevance realization or like reciprocal narrowing. And
Right.
the thing
Right.
that I think I'm kind of finding with a lot of my friends and just various social circles and stuff is that there's actually kind of a strange way in which the environment can actually reciprocally like instigate the reciprocal narrowing. And like I guess in some vague sense, I guess this would be like a more technical definition of political correctness or something. And I just wanted to see if there's like what sort of, I guess this is kind of a little bit along the lines of like for both you and Jordan Hall, when you guys kind of talk about just the certain collective solution. I mean, I know he like talked about the idea of like when you have like social mores about like just putting your wheel sideways or you get a ticket versus like actually reaching like certain levels of enforcement. It's like I guess like what are some ways that you feel are effective, at least in your experience, be it like either techniques or actual like dialectic in order to open or dialogue rather in order to open up a dialectic with people who are very kind of immediately like set in a way like in a particularly like ideological way or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. That's I mean, that's a core problem. And so there's an anthology coming out this year, put together by Christopher Mastropietro and I. We edited it and contributed to it. Got a lot of people from these emerging communities to contribute to it. A lot of people that you've heard of and that you've seen me do voices with Vervaeke around this sort of question. And in one of the chapters, I have a section that makes that question focal. And this is where my work sort of dovetails with Zach Stein's work. And what I don't think, when you meet people that are entrenched, meeting them at the propositional levels, especially the ones they want to defend. So if you meet them at the level of propositions and sort of standard moves of how we get knowledge about the world, I don't think there's much progress going to be made. If you engage in people in a discussion about ways in which, their lives are not possibly going the way they want, if they're willing to do that, because they might not be, and then there's not a lot you can do, because if people are not willing to consider the fact that in addition to knowledge, they need wisdom, they need to overcome self-deception. They need to enhance their ability to connect to other people. But what I have found, surprisingly, is a significant number of people, talking to an atheist and they're doing this kind of thing, and you say, well, yeah, let's not talk so much about whether or not there's a God, thing like that. And I'm not trying to do some sort of judo move to show you there's a God, but science is about overcoming self-deception. I'm really interested. Like, how do you overcome self-deception in your own life personally? And what kind of things do you do? Well, they'll say, I'll try to be more rational. Well, what does that mean? And what does that mean specifically? And what's the relationship between the kind of thing you're doing and like what people do when they go into therapy? Like, how do you put those all together? And typically, I can draw people into a discussion about something that everybody wants, which is to be wiser, to be more virtuous, to enhance their meaning in life. So that sometimes works, and that might be an initial way to get people considering the possibility of what I think we really need, in which I explicitly argued for in the chapter, was a pedagogical program of practices. So one of the things you can do is when people are coming in and they're in that sort of combative mode, you can use some introductory psychotechnologies like Peter Lindbergh's anti-debate or Edwin Reusch's empathy circling to shift them off and open them up, right, to the possibility of a form of dialogue that emphasizes communing with people, not just communicating with people, and that opens up the possibility that together we might help each other get to a place we can't get to individually. And then in parallel with that, you want them to be cultivating active open-mindedness, etc. Then perhaps they'd be ready for circling. And then perhaps after they've done circling, they'd be ready for dialectic into dialogos. So I've tried to give you two different answers. There's sort of on-the-street things you can do to try and shift the discussion off of what people know to how are they trying to love wisdom and become wiser. I'm not giving you an algorithm. That doesn't work all the time. I mean, there's just people that are entrenched. There are people that are assholes. But this does work with more people than you might expect. And in fact, it will often open people up to considering things. And this is sort of Plato's idea. Once you can get people to consider, then you can say, well, let's try this next thing. Let's try doing the anti-debate as we debate rather than debating. And then let's move from that into, empathy circling, where we start to get better at discussing these things without immediately objecting and rejecting each other. And then what you do is you can take people step by step by step. And you say, well, that could take a long time. Well, to be fair, it took them a long time to get where they are. And there's a lot of cultural machinery that reinforces it. You're not going to get a couple of sort of, listen to this and listen to this, and then there's going to be opening up. So there's things you can do, I think, sort of like verbal aikido on the street to get people to consider maybe that there's a path of education they can pursue, and then with the help of other people like Zach Stein and Christopher Mastropietro and all these, right, and Peter Lindbergh, like work out a step-by-step pedagogical program that enables people to move from that combative adversarial thing into genuine opponent processing, and then beyond genuine into flowing opponent processing, and then into dialectic, into dialogos. So that's my way of trying to respond to that issue that you've been talking about.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I really appreciate the sort of care that you've put forth into that response. I think it I'm glad to know that it's a pressing concern because it's caused a pretty it's definitely seems like it's something that's getting very difficult to kind of ignore, but it's I think it's very telling what you like exactly what you said about the idea that it took people a long time to get to where they are, and wisdom is, if it was easily acquired, right, it wouldn't be wisdom. So thank you very much.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, Spinoza said it. Everything excellent is rare.
Hey, thank you. Jules, you have a question for John.
Jules, good to hear from you.
Hey, you too, John. Have you been?
The past month has been hard, but I'm good, thank you.
You sound like you're firing on all cylinders, so that's good.
Yeah, that's I've got a lot of good people that support me very well, so I'm grateful for that.
I'm just writing down your Spinoza quote into the maxims. So, thanks for your time as always. The session before last, Q&A, you started talking about competencies, and it got me thinking, but I ran out of time for a question, so here it is.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could run your mind across a series of theories culminating in a Dreyfus approach. So the series of theories are Howard Gardner's multiple intelligence theory. That was criticized in the most scathing way by Jordan Peterson, pretty much just tossed out.
You want to do this step by step, or do you want me to hear the whole sequence first?
Yeah, let me do the sequence. It'll only take a minute.
I'll be quiet then.
Sure. But on the other hand, you have Ken Wilber, and the multiple intelligence thing is a major plank in his theory. He's calling it lines of development, I think. Lines of development. You can pull that a little bit further into the work Ken Robinson was doing before he died in pedagogy, which didn't have a lot of theoretical punch, but it really connected with people. Just simply the idea of recognizing that different people are good at different things. So I'm drawing that all into, and it may not connect, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it if it does, how Hubert Dreyfus and his brother wrote that book about skill acquisition.
Yep, very much.
And I'm just wondering, can you run your mind across that to see if there's a connection, comment on multiple intelligences and the connection through to skills, if that's okay.
Okay. So I literally wrote a chapter on intelligence for an introductory to psychology textbook a couple years ago. And so and this is something I do a lot of work on. I'm afraid to tell you that this is an instance where I pretty much in very almost complete agreement with Jordan Peterson. I think the idea of multiple intelligences just doesn't fly. I think that I want to be careful. That's not to say that everybody does exactly the same thing, because that's often a misunderstanding of the alternative. But yeah, speaking as a scientist studying intelligence, like Jordan, I think the argument for multiple intelligence is very weak. Even more so, the argument for learning styles has been a theoretical position that has been given multiple opportunities to find confirmation and has been repeatedly disconfirmed. So it's something that people want to find true. They keep doing experimental and empirical investigations to find if it's true, in varying ways because they're motivated. And yet what keeps happening is it keeps getting disconfirmed. And then you may say, but there seems to be apparent differences between people. So nobody's denying individual differences. Well, what we're talking about here is whether or not these constructs of learning styles actually exist and whether these multiple intelligences actually exist. And so, Jules, I don't want to be harsh with you because you always come in good faith, but I want to also be honest with you. I did extensive review, and not that long ago, for that chapter on the relevant literature, the relevant empirical data, the theoretical debate, the experimental competition. I'm convinced there's nothing like learning styles. Now, the problem with that is the theoretical language might not have been actually, as you've heard me say multiple times, the language of training and the language of explaining are not the same thing. Many of these teachers, I think, were doing important things, and they were using language, but it turned out to be the language of training, and they thought it was the language of explaining. But when we take that language of explaining, which is theoretical knowledge, and we try and look for confirmation, we can't find it. And so, and same thing with multiple intelligences.
Sorry to jump
go
in.
ahead.
You're very courteous as always, but just to be clear, I'm not on either side on that debate.
Okay.
But I figured that you would have a more rigorous, and of course you do.
Okay. But I didn't want to just bulldoze you either, right?
No, that's fine. No, that's good. I mean, what it makes me think of though, do you mind if I just roll on for a second here?
I pretty much said what I needed to say. I mean, I'd like to come back if possible and say how I think all the valuable stuff in Dreyfus is still there and available for us. But go ahead.
No. I think I'll be hogging it if I keep going. So yeah, please round out. Yeah.
Well, so like I said, I like the idea of multiple intelligences, and learning styles, and there's all kinds of variations on this. I'm an auditory learner. I'm a visual learner. Other than people being blind or deaf, it's not clear what that means in any kind of empirically verifiable manner. We have to be careful because we are often tempted to introduce these constructs that come out of the common sense language of training. We talk as if there's willpower. There was a theory that actually developed that, Baumeister. He published a book on it. He got all this, and then it's completely fallen apart because it has massively failed to replicate. It's been disconfirmed multiple times, and so at least in a psychological sense, there isn't such a thing. And you say, well, there's something, yeah, but that's all you can conclude. All right, and so the same thing with grit, right? And we throw these things out. We think there's something to them, and then when we try it, collapse. Now, not all of them do. Some of them stick. Some of them, like cognitive biases, that's really robust and reliable. So, like again, we have to be, and this is why I keep saying this again and again, and I don't know if I'm saying it well enough. We repeatedly fall prey to confusing the language of training, which is very efficacious, with the truth of the language of explaining, which is a very different thing. And because of that, I think that's why I reject those things. But when I turn to Dreyfus, what I see is somebody who's really taking great care to try and use the best cognitive science to map between how people train their skills and how we should try and explain them. I see the exact opposite. I see somebody like, I have criticisms of Dreyfus, but I see somebody who's bringing care and sophistication, and he's trying to say, no, we have to come up with the proper bridging between our language of training and language of explaining if we're going to properly explain procedural knowledge. And so I take Dreyfus as a counterexample, as somebody who, like I say, I'm not endorsing everything he says. I'm saying as how he goes about what he's doing, I'm endorsing it. He is engaging in the philosophically challenging task of trying to bridge between the language of training and the language of explaining, which many people don't do. So I take Dreyfus as an exemplar of what is exactly needed.
Perfect. Thanks, John.
So I hope I wasn't too strident on that. I get very passionate about this because this is an error, and this is not only an error in the world of common sense, but this is an error endemic to academic psychology that I think is just undermining our psychological theorization, and it's got to be like significantly addressed. So that's why I tend to be very passionate about it.
I think you're right to be, and you're the right person to come in on this. So I don't think you're being too strident, but passion for a viable construct is necessary. So I like it. Thanks again, John.
Thank you, Jules. Great pleasure talking to you as always.
A pleasure too. Thank you, sir.
Mark, you have a question for John.
Hello, John.
Hey, Mark, how are you? Good to hear from you.
I'm doing all right. I'm sorry to hear you had a busy month, but they're all busy for you relative to the goofing off.
Yeah, it wasn't just busy. It was hard. There was a lot of stuff happening in my life that was very emotionally demanding, very existentially challenging. So yeah, it was beyond busy. It was something more. So yeah, that's it. But things are better now. Things are better now.
Oh, good. Well, better is good. Yeah, that's some days all better is all we can hope for. Yeah, it's been challenging for everybody these past couple of months. Certainly on the tail end of all the mess that's going on. I came up with a bunch of slides, and I was listening to your Stoa talk, the value, virtue, purpose, and meaning talk.
Oh, the one with Stephen and the two Gregs.
Yes. And I think it was Stephen who, and I don't normally listen in the car, but I was driving up to Charlotte, and I said, well, for once, I'm not going to listen to music. I'm going to do something, quote, productive. And it was very productive, because I think it was Stephen who said something like, narratives are pinned in time, I think was his phrase. And I was like, oh, that's definitely wrong. Like, I know right away that's wrong, right? And there's this whole thing around, you did the talk with Mary Cohen and Paul Vanderklay around, story and narrative, and I didn't get the sense that anybody had a good definition. So I wanted to put one forth and see what you thought of it. It's already been kicked around, well, at least by Manuel. It's usually a good drumming. So I'm thinking, if I go from the bottom up, that stories are the in-time instantiation or participation tied to a point in time of a specific narrative. With the caveat that
so the story is sort of an instantiation of a particular narrative type. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I was just about to caveat narrative being an attempt at making a template, not necessarily a template. But that's your attempt, right? So in Peterson terms, right, that would be the iterative game you're playing to find narrative, is to play out as many stories as you can, whether they be in your imagination or in real life, right? And then the next layer up would be the narrative. I guess it's a pattern. I don't like that term, but I just wrote this one down on my slide deck here. So those are the templates, where you think you can live, because that pattern plays out in a way that reduces the combinatorial explosion of you acting out, whatever level of participation in whatever system you're embedded in. So that would be what the narrative is. So they're at least invariant across time.
Yeah. So is this analogous sort of to like the Jungian idea of the like the archetype is a perennial organizational pattern, and then the particular images are particular instantiations of that. So the archetype of the hero is a I agree with you about pattern being a nebulous term, but let's just use it because it's hard to come up with an alternative right now. Right. It's a kind of pattern that organizes people's lives, but the way the hero archetype plays out, as Campbell argued, the hero with 10,000 faces, right? Or was it 1,000 or 10,000? Right. It sounds like that's the kind of model you're arguing for, which is ultimately a Platonic model, right? Because Jung is just the Plato of the psyche. Is that fair? Am I getting you correctly, or am I getting you unfairly?
Not quite. Well, I don't think it's unfair. These are brand new ideas. Wednesday, right? So, like stuff we're playing out. So if a narrative is a template and a story is an implementation of the template, then the top level would be something. And this is where I'm like way out, like I'm in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, right? Archetypal emanations or something, right? And then so we're playing these iterative story games to find all the valid narrative patterns that are, say, invariant across time or something. And then that points at the archetypal. I want to use emanations because I think that's concurrent with how you're using the term, but I'm totally prepared to be completely off base on that.
I don't have the licensing power or agreement for the term. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of and I hope this is helpful. It's definitely meant to be complimentary. That's sort of the Neoplatonic take on myth that I've been trying to argue for. I think that there are these, there are perennial patterns, both in reality and in our behavior, and they represent sort of invariant structures, conditions in reality, sets of constraints in reality at various levels. And yeah, that they play out in how they regulate how various processes unfold, and that we try to form ourselves to those unfolding processes by doing many things. One of the things we do is tell stories. The other thing we do is create symbols. We also enact rituals, etc. So there's ways in which, we try to, in time, because what Plato said, that time was the moving image of eternity. In time, we try to play out better and better instantiations of those primordial patterns that have something to do with the ultimate constitutive sort of structure of reality, and that structure is a top-down constraint. It constrains how processes can unfold through time. So, and we, of course, we also do this with scientific theory. We take invariant patterns, and then we lay out a sequence of inferences that is also supposed to try to help us understand in time how something that's timeless, like E equals MC squared, plays out. So we sort of tell the argument of, well, this will cause, etc. So yeah, that's sort of the Neoplatonic picture. Yes, I think that's right. Now, I think when we're doing that and we're using symbols in order to try and overcome self-deception, I think that's when overcome self-deception and afford increased activity, meaning in life, and thereby enhance relevance realization. Yeah, I think that's when we're talking about mythos. I think when we use symbols and stories and celebrations and all those things I talked about in order to enhance religio, I think that's when we're into mythos.
Okay. Yeah, no, that sounds good. I mean, it sounds like, I figured we were in the Platonic realm because right after that I was drawing these triangles. I'm going, oh no, why does this work? And Manuel and I were panicking about why this works out so well, and we drew like, I don't know, half a dozen triangles on things and went, oh yeah, this pattern plays out all the time. And I have a whole presentation based on, politics is why we're at today, and where people like John are going is to add the higher power, which adds the perspective, and then we have a third move that we're making with that, and I've got a whole slide deck around that I'm going to experiment with. But it sounds like you're basically in line, and this has been one of my frustrations, and one of the frustrations of people on the Discord server that talk about such things is, we needed a good definition of story versus narrative, and how do archetypes fit in, and it sounds like you're okay with narrative is the template, story is the actual implementation, and archetype is above.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fine. I mean, but the difficulty you're going to have with that, of course, is many people are going to equivocate around narrative, and so you're gonna be like, that's why I'm kind of hesitant to use it as a term. I did think about something, and I'm not trying to bring up the whole debate around parabolic knowing, because I think that's playing out nicely. I think both sides are getting to say what they want to say, and I don't want to try and use this forum to trumpet. So I'm actually saying something that I don't know if this I think might be helpful to you, maybe even a concession towards that. I was thinking that Corbin has this argument about the imaginal as that which is needed to bridge between the sensual, the experiential, and the conceptual. And it also simultaneously bridges between the subjective and the objective. And it sounds to me sometimes like what you and Manuel, and sometimes what Mary is saying, and sometimes what Paul is saying, although I'm not sure you guys are all saying the same thing. I'm really not sure you're all saying the same thing. That maybe that's what you're trying to point to. And I'm wondering if that's, maybe you want to look at that work, because I think Corbin's distinction between the imaginal and the imaginary, especially with the way he talks about the imaginal, might be what, and Corbin and Jung were serious colleagues. They were at the Uranus conferences regularly and reliably together. And Corbin talks a lot about Jung. Jung doesn't give enough credit to Corbin, which was a little bit of a dick move on Jung's part. But it's clear from all the records from the Uranus that they were having a deep influence on each other. And I think, and Corbin, I think is absolutely stunningly brilliant. And I've tried to incorporate his notion of the imaginal already into my work. There's various episodes of the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis where I talked about it. So maybe like, because I really want to understand what you guys are saying. Maybe, and you may reject this, and that's okay. We're friends, and we're trying to talk to each other via logos, right? But I maybe what you're trying to talk about with the parabolic is the kind of knowing that makes use of the imaginal, and therefore bridges simultaneously between the sensual and the abstract conceptual, and also the objective and the subjective. And that's sort of, and that's, I think I've got Corbin right, because I've talked to Thomas Chetham on this, and he's sort of the world expert on it. He's literally writing all the books on it. And the thing about that is Corbin therefore sort of bridges between Jung, who's really emphasizes individuation, and Buber, who really emphasizes participation. He bridges between them. Anyways, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but that's a suggestion. I'm trying to discuss this stuff in good faith with you guys.
Oh, no, that's great, John. Actually, that's very helpful. So I would just say, and this is new, and Manuel came up with it, so now I don't like it because I'm disagreeable. He was being brilliant all day today, and tired my brain out. But he said, what if it's called the poetic way of knowing? And then what I would say is the thing you just described is our version of perspectival understanding, and that's we're kind of stealing that from, you've used it a couple times in a couple of your videos. Yeah. Understanding rather than knowing, and that's the bridge. We actually have a slide deck coming about imaginal and all of that as well. And I think if narrative is the template and stories the instantiation, then it makes it easier for everybody to talk about what narrative and story is and what they mean by them, rather than everybody equivocating on the words.
Yeah, which is something that really I want to avoid as much as possible. Well, this sounds good. This sounds like I look forward to seeing it. This sounds really cool.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, John. That's great.
Oh, and I think somebody has their mic on. Okay, I think that's better. Thanks, thanks, guys. Struan, you're up next.
Hi, John.
Hi, Strawn. Always glad to talk to you.
Yeah, well, you kind of derailed the question that I had again. So it was what you were saying to Jules and Mark that actually got me thinking, because in our previous conversation, we were talking about the logos and the mythos, right? And it sounded to me sort of like you were saying that you were looking for the logos of the mythos. And then to paraphrase where I'm coming from, I'm saying, but what about the mythos of the logos?
Yeah.
And when you were talking about the language of explaining versus the language of training, I was wondering, what do you think about the idea that the language of logos is the language of explaining, and the language of mythos is the language of training?
I sort of think that. And I think your point, which is actually, I think, Dreyfus's point, which came out in my, I think, to Jules about, we definitely should not conflate them or equate them. And that we do need a logos of the mythos, but we actually also do need a mythos of the logos. And I'm glad to hear Mark saying that the distinction between understanding and knowledge is coming in, because I think that's part of a way of trying to get the appropriate relationship between the two of them worked out. But I agree with you. I think it needs to be symmetrical. I think we do need a logos of the mythos and a mythos of the logos. And if you watch a couple of those videos I've had with Nick Winkleman on the language of training, I think they really flesh out some of what that looks like. How we get them sort of reciprocally responsive to each other.
Yeah, I liked it. Well, I liked the way that he was speaking at the very least. Like, just his approach to the subject matter. Like, it felt very hands-on. I don't know how else to put it. So I enjoyed that very much. It's just, well, the whole idea is very interesting to me, actually, because I was half wondering if you didn't want to play like the foil of because you said last time that you're happy to play the foil. But what I see happening, at least historically, is like on the one side you have the argument or the rationalist side of things, and on the other side you have the Gnostic or the romantic side of things. And and I kind of half wonder if maybe, the rationalists wanted the language of explaining and the romantics wanted the language of training. And that's, this is actually something that's been going back for thousands of years.
Yeah,
and
Sorry, I'm interrupting you. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So I was just, that's a conversation I want to have with you, because I very much get the impression that you come from the rationalist side of things and I come from the romantic side of things. And so, in terms of an opponent processing, I think the conversation would be useful in that perspective, because, well, I at least get the impression that we'd both be trying to get something out of it.
Yeah, I think that's true. Maybe we want to set up a Voices with Vervaeke around that, if you're open to being more public, because I think that might be helpful to many people. I mean, consider that. That's an invitation. And
okay.
Also, yeah, I mean, I'm going to try to be fair to myself, and that's a weird place to be in. I've tried to criticize the rationalist view of reason very deeply. Right? I think their view of reason.
Yes, you have a.
Yeah. And then
I
tried to. Well, just let me say a couple things, okay?
Yeah.
And then I've tried to criticize romantic notion of imagination. People who I respect say that they don't typically say that I'm unfair to the rationalists, but they typically say that I'm to some degree unfair to the romantics. That's why I've been trying to be a little bit more qualified when I say I'm trying to criticize decadent romanticism. I like the people that come right after Kant and before the romantics and Hegel. Like, I like people like Schlegel, the early post-Kantians. And to some degree, Barfield is influenced that way, but his take on romanticism is also not sort of the standard take. That being said, so what I'm trying to say is I'm really trying to open myself up to a much more nuanced, bidirectional, critical, I mean in both senses of the word critique, understanding of the relationship between the two. I think it's fair for you to put me more in the rationalist camp than the romantic camp, largely because I don't think the romantic camp has been given enough criticism in the way in which, for example, the romantic idea of love has been pretty much a disaster and is causing tremendous suffering in what are called, I think incorrectly, romantic relationships. And because of that amount of suffering, that has sort of irked me. It's made me angry, I guess, to try and be really honest about this, because I want to try and reduce the massive influence that has, and the way it's so destructive in people's lives. So I'm saying that perhaps skewing isn't ultimately epistemologically justified. It has more to do with the way I'm particularly engaged in trying to reduce a pervasive kind of suffering that I see in the world. So that's how I'm going to respond.
Well, fair enough. I would just say that when I characterize you as more in the rationalist camp, I'm just speaking purely temperamentally. I would. Yeah. So it's not meant to be anything pejorative. I agree with you at least. Yeah. But I very much agree with you with your criticisms of, let's say, for example, romantic comedies, right? The typical chick flick. But at the same time, like there's a baby in the bathwater, because the recipe of the rom-com is something like, boy meets girl, boy gets girl, and then boy loses girl, then boy gets girl, right? But that trope plays out because you can see within the information spectrum, what a woman might be interested in is the difficulties of actually having a relationship with a guy, and what knowledge it might be necessary in order to navigate those difficulties. So the structure of the story is highly salient for a reason. But obviously, if it becomes like romantic porn or whatever, then it's going to be degenerate. And so I very much agree with your desire for that to be wise. Like, it has to be. And so I recognize that that's why I think there's validity in asking about what's the logos of the mythos. And to your point with respect to rationality, yes, I completely agree. Like when you speak of rationality, I try and think of it as a thing on its own. Even insofar as I know you try and appeal to the older ideas of logos and whatever, but I see that as distinct, and it's not something that I can judge based on what Plotinus or what Plato or what Parmenides had to say about the logos. So I just want to extend you that courtesy at the very least.
Thank you. I guess. Well, thank you. I guess to the rom-com. I mean, I think attachment theory, Bowlby and Ainsworth, attachment theory, the evidence is now becoming very robust, very powerful. That is a much better way of understanding how our so-called romantic relationships are going to operate, and that if we started enculturating and teaching people those structures, the patterns in which that unfolds in people's relationships, I think that would be just tremendously both more accurate about how these relationships work, and also tremendously more helpful and beneficial to people. And so I guess I'm even more critical than you are of the rom-com. I think they're filling up a space. They're being a placeholder, and I think something better that can take that place, and it should take that place. So that's my concern.
So is your next role movie writing there, John?
Well, the next role is I want to try and, like, especially in After Socrates, I want to bring in, because of he talks about Eros a lot, and he talks about Philia. I want to bring in attachment theory and how much it's playing out underneath the currents of us trying to engage in dialogos, because of course Plato takes great pains to show that. I mean, he doesn't have an attachment theory, but he's trying to show people's temperament and their upbringing, etc., and their character are having an impact. And what attachment theory is, it picks up on that deep grammar of how our relationships form. And like I say, it's the evidence for it is mounting. It's powerful, and it needs to be given a kind of common recognition and exposure that is being blocked by the standard romantic discourse and the standard romantic comedy sort of tropes of how relationships unfold. Yeah. I do intend to explicitly bring this material in. I'm doing a lot of work on this right now, not just sort of theoretically, but also personally and existentially. And I mean, so I have a friend and colleague, good friend and colleague at the University of Toronto. I've had a couple of open public discussions with him. My friend is Jeff McDonald, and he says when it comes to relationships, including romantic relationships, attachment theory is the way, the truth, and the life. And the degree to which people are ignorant of it, the degree to which their ignorance is covered over by this paper mache thing of romanticism, I think is the way in which people are imprisoned into a deep and horrible kind of suffering that is actually something that we can significantly ameliorate and avoid. And so I guess I'm doing a bit of a soapbox here, but I think this is a way in which we can significantly improve the meaning in life for a lot of people. Because for most people, and this is also a failure that romanticism has given us, most people, they try and pour most of their spirituality and their meaning in life into their romantic relationships under the guise of romanticism, which almost inevitably dooms them to fail. And so I want to do something to help people on this. I want to do something to make a difference. So that's why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Well, from my perspective, John, I just want to say that's actually very encouraging to hear, and I look forward to it.
Oh, well, thank you, Strun. Thank you.
Thanks. Quentin, you have a question for John.
Hi, yes. Hi, John. I'm working through the Wisdom of Hypatia book again. Part of this goes through studying Stoicism at the moment, and I'm reading through Pierre Hadot's and the Citadel book. Really enjoying it. I just want to say thank you for recommending it. So my question is,
you're welcome.
Marcus Aurelius.
I can't quite hear you. Could you maybe speak a little bit more slowly, because it's kind of blurry. Your voice is kind of blurry. Sorry for doing that. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure.
This should be better.
That's infinitely better. Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
very good.
So you're working through the Wisdom of Hypatia. Did I hear you correctly? And Pierre Hadot's The Inner Citadel. Did I hear you correctly?
Yes, that's correct.
Excellent, excellent, great.
All right, so with the technical issues out of the way, so I stumbled upon a maxim from Marcus Aurelius. It goes, erase your representation, extinguish your desire, stop your impulse to action, always have your guiding principle. I think the Greek is hege monokon, within your power.
Yep.
I've just been meditating on that word for a while. I was wondering if you could explain it a bit and maybe expound a bit on what your guiding principle is. And it, related to that, I'm wondering if virtue is related to the way Marcus uses the word power in that.
Yeah,
maxim.
yeah, that's exactly right. And so the word virtue originally means a power, and it means therefore a real potential and ability, and it carries with it also the sense of virtuosity. So a real skillful power to realize what the right thing to think and say, what the right things to think, say, and do are in any particular situation. And of course, therefore, virtue is a particular way in which we are wise in the situation. That's what I often mean when I say that virtue is the beauty of wisdom. So I think that's definitely what's going on. And what the Stoics were on about is that we have a capacity. It's talked about, in fact, also within cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. Most of the cognitive therapies and related ones. It's talked about if you look at the verbal self-defense literature, like the Verbal Aikido book. We have a capacity to do what Stanovich calls uncouple. We have a space between the stimulus and our reaction to it, and we can widen that space. And in that space, we can evaluate according to true standards of true, good, and beautiful, the particular impressions that are coming into us and the particular impulses that are coming out of us. And the idea is both the impressions in and the impulses out have to pass through that space, and that space is completely autonomous in the sense of autonomos. It is self-governing, it is self-regulating, and we can grow that space, and in that space we can intervene on, I'll use sort of more cognitive behavioral language. Marcus Aurelius wouldn't quite use this term, but I think this is reasonably what he's saying. We can intervene on the meaning of our actions. Are they virtuous or not? And we can intervene on the meaning of our impressions. Are they true or beautiful or not? And then what we want to do is make sure that we are generating virtuous actions, because that's in our power, not the consequences of our actions, but that our actions are using that power of trying to see what's true and what's good in our impressions and then act accordingly. And so that cultivation and growth of that space, both sort of making it larger and also making it more responsive, sensitive, so that it can pick up on earlier on the impression, earlier on in the impulse, can pick up on it in a more nuanced, discerning fashion, that it has a more creative ability to reframe the possible meanings. That's what I think Marcus Aurelius is trying to point to. So for me, that's what it means. I think I'm in agreement with Marcus Aurelius that the guiding principle is to try and situate yourself as deeply as possible in that autonomous space. It would go beyond Stoics, of course. I would go into the Neoplatonists, the wisdom of Hypatia, that space needs to itself be centered and grounded into what Proclus calls the one within, which is what Jung calls the self, what internal family systems theory also calls the self, what dialectical behavioral theory calls the wise mind. That space between the impression and the impulse needs to itself be grounded in and sustained by that deeper state of the principle that is self-regulating the entire psyche as a whole, and trying to integrate you not just in your thinking, but in all of your being, your connotative, your conative, your biological, etc. And the Neoplatonists go further, that one within itself has to be sustained, grounded in, and nourished by the one within reality itself. So while I agree that with Marcus Aurelius that my guiding principle is key, I think that the guiding principle ultimately depends on the one within and the one without. And so my guiding principle is much more, therefore, a Neoplatonic one than just a purely Stoic one, because Stoicism was taken up to and it was integrated into Neoplatonism. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful response. That gives me a lot to think about. Your use of the word I think you said autonoetic, that kind of deepened my understanding of participatory knowing.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. I'm glad that's helpful for you. Yeah. So I think one of the I didn't say this clearly enough in the classes, because it hadn't gotten clear. But one of the points of the Neoplatonic practices is exactly that resonance between the one within and the one without, to strengthen it, because very often we need to plug into that space within ourselves in order to get between our deeply entrenched patterns of impulse and reactivity to impressions. And so while I think it's important to do the cognitive training that Marcus Aurelius is talking about, I think it's necessary. I don't think it's sufficient. I think that has to be put into practices in which that space that space within, basically within working memory, that we can go to open up and give us some freedom, self-determination about our impressions and our impulses. I think it ultimately has to be grounded and nourished, like I said, in that Neoplatonic fashion. And that's, I didn't make that clear, how the Neoplatonic practices within the wisdom of Hypatia nourish, the one within us, the Jungian self, the wise mind, by precisely putting it into a reciprocal opening resonance with the one of the world, if I can put it that way. So I'm sorry I didn't make that clear when I taught the wisdom of Hypatia. I think that's important to say now.
Well, I think you can be forgiven for that, because you made numerous other things quite clear. So don't be too hard on yourself. Thank you for that answer.
Well, thank you for your understanding. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because one of the things I've been trying to do, and I'm going to continue to do, is to try and integrate the psychodynamic stuff with this cognitive science stuff, and try and integrate also like these wisdom traditions with the psychodynamic traditions that are also emerging right now and are very powerful. Trying to get it all together so that they can talk to each other and afford and transform each other, like a process of reciprocal reconstruction. That's something that's really getting central to my mind right now. How do we properly differentiate and integrate, therefore complexify, the relationship between spirituality and the psychotherapeutic healing of mental health issues? How do we integrate spiritual health and psychodynamic health and cognitive health all properly together?
All right. Default mode, you have a question for John.
Hello, John. It's great to talk to you.
Hey, great to talk to you too.
Yeah, so I had two mini questions that I'd love to run by you. One is concerning an idea that I've recently come across from Freud concerning screen memories.
Yeah.
So the way that he describes screen memories is that you can remember an event from your childhood. So I can remember going to the zoo. I can remember having a fight with my sister, something like that. So you can remember a pure event like that. But you can also have you can have a memory about your childhood. And and what I mean by you could have a memory about your childhood is this sort of like semi-phantasmagoric kind of like ghost memory, if you'd want to call it, where there's no event that you're remembering, but you're remembering it kind of has to do with your identity, but it's not just your identity. So what I'm asking is that I've also come across another quote from Heraclitus, and he says that you can never step in the same river twice. So I'd love to hear from a cognitive science perspective or an information processing perspective on specifically why can we have some memories which are more on the line of very clear, and other memories that are blurred into an identity that we have, where they're bound up with an identity that we have.
Okay, so let me give you a metaphor analogy for how we should think of memory, drawn from memory researchers. We think of memory like a recording or like a storehouse. I want you to think of your memory like a compost heap, in which the things near the surface are pretty much the way you put them in there. But as you go deeper down, your memory is increasingly reconstructive. It's increasingly altering memories. It's increasingly fusing memories together. And you say, well, some of my oldest memories are accurate. Be very careful about that, because the further you go back in your memories, the more those memories are not the way you think they are. There's more that multiple different memories have been fused together, and those memories have been rewritten so that they are more coherent with your current self. So that's the whole metaphor of the compost heap. And so you may say, well, that's a really bad system for memory. Actually, it's a really great system for memory. This is what you don't want. Because you actually have a choice between these two things. So let's say you're in heaven before you're about to be reincarnated or something like that, and God offers you two alternatives. have one of these or the other, but you can't have both because they're in a trade-off relationship. You can have an accurate record of the past, or you can have an intelligent foresight for the future. What do you want? What do you want? Bet you'll choose intelligent foresight for the future, because that chances are that's going to help you achieve your goals. It's going to help you avoid suffering. That's what your memory is trying to do. Your memory is trying to come up with the best intelligent foresight of the future. And so if that means slamming two separate pieces of information together so that you have a better chance at picking up on what might come down to you from the future, it'll do that. If that means losing a lot of stuff, it'll do that. If it means making a more coherent relationship between your current mental state and your memory so you can use your memories more adaptively to predict the future, it'll do that. Your memory is highly reconstructive, highly adaptive, because it is trying to make you an intelligent foreseer of the future rather than an accurate recorder of the past. And this is why I say things like 49% of confident eyewitness testimony is actually false. All the work of Elizabeth Loftus is how easy it is to plant a memory in people. I could do something like this. Like if we were in person, I could ask you to imagine doing something in this situation in which we were sitting. Say, imagine doing this. Don't actually do it, just imagining it. And then I come back 2 weeks later and I ask you, do you remember that thing I described? Did you do it, or did you just imagine doing it? You're very likely to say, no, I actually did it. So you'll also confuse imagining doing things with doing things. You say, well, how is that helpful? Well, imagination brings in possibilities that haven't been enacted. By integrating them with things that's actually occurred, that makes you better at finding new patterns that you haven't seen yet. That makes you an intelligent foreseer rather than an accurate rememberer or an accurate recorder. And this is why, right? This is why you are so much, one of the reasons among many, why you are so much smarter than your computer, because you have reconstructive adaptive memory. The computer has a way of being a very accurate recorder of the past. And it turns out those are in a trade-off relationship, because you have to give up on one to gain the other. So that's why your memory, and you say, well, why does it become fused into your identity? Well, a big part of what your identity is the way in which all of this reconstruction and making things relevant in the current period is what you mean by yourself. Chris Mastropietro and Greg Enriquez and I have started recording the next series we're going to do together. We've already recorded the first episode of The Elusive I, capital I, The Elusive I, the nature and function of the self. But you see what's going on there is, right, like I said, it's making you adaptive. Here's an easy way of showing you what I'm talking about. It's called the myth of the end of history. If you ask people, say when they're 30, how much have you changed in the last 10 years? Oh, I've changed a lot. How much will you change in the next 10 years? Oh, I won't change very much. Then you ask them when they're 40, how much have you changed in the last 10 years? Oh, I've changed a lot. How much will you change in the next 10 years? Oh, I won't change very much. Then you ask them when they're 50, how much, you see? And that pattern keeps repeating all the way through.
Yeah, just to riff off of that, the idea about memory reconstruction. It's really funny because I wanted to ask you a question about when we're reading a book, for example, and like an author is reconstructing a phenomenon. They can do it in a certain way which is super, super precise. And I'm just wondering, Henry Bergson made the comment that what philosophy is missing is precision, right? So I'd love to sort of there's also this old saying where it's like, you read a book when you're young, you'll read it a certain way, but then when you read it in adulthood, you'll read it in a different way, and then finally but that's what makes it a good book, right? So I'd love to hear what is it about an author in which they can reconstruct or reconfigure a phenomenon to be in a certain way which strikes you as deeply, deeply real or deeply, deeply precise. But I've had other authors where you go, no, that's not it. So what is it about? Yeah, that's it. And no, that's not it. Like there's something about the reality that they're reconstructing, which has some bullshit in it, or in which it has no bullshit in it, and it's the most truest idea that you've ever come across.
Yeah, and so that goes towards a lot of work I've been trying to do on this sense of realness, and it appears throughout the series, and it's an ongoing thing to try and understand it. And I mean, I think it has to do with ways in which problems are being formulated by an author. But I think when we're coming down to like what you're saying, like describing or reconstructing or constructing a situation, and I think this comes down to Merleau-Ponty's idea of optimal grip. I think a good author gets this nice fluid balance between the features, right, and the gestalt, and gets that and shifts that balance around according to the task at hand, the particular place in the story where things are unfolding, the particular potential change in direction of the character's development, and gets the optimal grip on the situation that plugs into the plot and the character development in a way that we go, yeah, that all fits, that all makes sense. It gives you a sense of presence. That's why I talk about the sense of presence in perspectival knowing. It gives you that sense of presence that we also get in video games. Now, the interesting thing about the video games is they tell us that sense of presence is not dependent, and here's why I'm a little bit critical of Bergson, not dependent on verisimilitude. You can have a video game that's really realistic in the sense of verisimilitude, and it will not generate that sense of presence. It will not generate that sense of realness. You can get something that's not realistic in that sense at all, like Tetris, and people will get that sense of presence, like they're really in the game, and it becomes very real to them. It has to do, and that's partially because you're getting people into flow state, and the flow state is a way of having very powerful optimal grip. I think good authors are good at getting us to induce an optimal grip on the situation that plugs us in to that point in the narrative and that point in character development. Sorry, I should say the story, to follow up what I said with Mark, right? And that, and I think that's what, just like the video game, it's that sense of presence, of that sense of really being in it, that is what the author is good at doing. That would be my proposal to you.
That is beautifully insightful. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Thank you.
All right, so I think we have time for hopefully two questions left. We'll get to, I think, Jack and Fursius. So Jack, you have a question for John.
Hello, John. It's nice to talk to you.
Good. Talk to you too.
Since we're low on time, you said something that was both flexing about there not being different levels of intelligence as well, but mostly about there not being different learning styles, and also the effect that this has on teaching people, because I know when studying education, you tend to learn that every kid has a different learning style, and you have to teach that learning style. So I'm interested in like if there's any good places to look into this, and like.
Which do you mean? To look into alternatives to it, or to look in some of the research that sort of undermines it?
Learning styles, yeah.
I'd have to look at that. I mean, I could probably get the information and maybe give it to Brett, or because I'd have to go back and look at all the citations I did in that chapter about sort of the research that undermined learning styles. I can also talk to my son. He's in Teachers College right now, and he's gone through a lot of the literature. I think that Haiti, in his visible learning stuff, has collated all the stuff that it's actually predictive of learning, and things like learning style and a bunch of things that we're taught are really, really important to kids' learning, don't turn out to be things that are actually really important to kids' learning. So that might be a good place to start there too. I think it's Haiti. Let me just hang on one sec. One sec. Hopefully you can still hear my voice. I'm just going to my library to get something.
Can hear you just fine.
Yeah, so maybe a place to start is so the work by John Hatie, Hattie, Visible Learning, a synthesis of over 800 meta-analyses relating to achievement, and a lot of the stuff that actually, I think that does both. It might point you towards some of the more critical literature. I'm trying to think. Sorry, I can't remember any of the specific. I mean, I was writing an entire chapter, so I don't remember specific citations of specific sightings. I can try and dig some of that stuff up, But the place you might want to look, like I said, is at the Haiti book, because it actually goes through the things that are really to be really predictive of students successfully learning, and it sort of undermines a lot of the popular claims of things that seem to matter to student learning.
Wow.
So some of them are very important, but you have to be really careful about some of them. So it's clear that if children experience stereotype threat, that will undermine their education. Pretty good evidence for that. The idea of diversity in the classroom improving education, there's very little evidence for that. I'm not anti-diversity. There's political reasons for doing that. That's not what I'm saying. But making the claim that it has a pedagogical function doesn't have good support, right? But what does have good support is when individuals feel stereotype threat. That does undermine their capacity to learn, right? And so, like I pick that because that's just an example of how and this goes back to the question about being really careful here. Like we've got to be much more nuanced and discerning in how we're trying to do these things. And so, anyways, that's a recommendation to a place you might take a look at. Maybe that'll be helpful to you.
That's great. Thank you very much.
And the last question is to Fursius.
Hi, John. Thanks for taking my question.
You're welcome.
And it's probably quite a broad question. It's regarding the idea of intention. And I've watched a lot of your materials, and I'm kind of curious whether you or philosophers in the past have addressed the idea of intention and how important intention might be as a concept in interpreting reality, let's say.
Intention is it's central to a lot of philosophical thought. And even the way it comes into legal thought, mens rea is the idea of the intentional act ultimately. I think what we typically mean by intention of doing things on purpose is part of it's an aspect of the more broader phenomena of intentionality, the fact that our mental life is directed to things beyond itself. Think about things, we move towards things, and in that sense, intentionality is one of the most central topics in cognitive science and the philosophy of mind. How is it that our minds intend towards things, either in action or in thought, is one of the central questions that people are trying to address in cognitive science right now. And again, what's the difference between when we learn things like that way and when we don't learn them that way? And people get a little bit confused around that. So I won't go into that. Actually, I was going to bring that up, but that's just to bring up a confusion, to remove it. Maybe it's better to leave it aside. But this whole idea that our minds are directed beyond themselves, either when we're acting on purpose or when we're thinking on purpose, that is like a big topic in the philosophy of mind. It's a huge topic in cognitive science. How do we? And for the longest time, the standard answer to both of those was I form representations. I have something in my mind that's kind of like a picture or a sentence about the world. And that's what allows me to think about the world. And that's what allows me to form goal-directed behavior. What's been happening the last 30 years in cognitive science is that idea that we are intentional because we are representational is being seriously challenged and, to my mind, undermined. And so we have to replace it with a different understanding and account of what intentionality is and how we think and act on purpose. And you can see quite a bit of my work about trying to come up with an alternative way of understanding how the mind is connected to reality and directed towards reality without necessarily relying on a purely representationalist model. So these are all key issues, big issues. And you said it's a broad question, so sort of giving you a very broad, sweeping answer. But that's what that I think it's like. Yeah, that is one of the big things that it's one of the big topics.
Okay, it's interesting that you took it in but you took it in the cog science direction. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like talking about attention, right? The way that we focus.
No,
I guess my question was about the philosophical side of things, or rather, almost the metaphysical side of things, like intention as a more fundamental aspect. Not to disparage anything that you said, but it was interesting that you presented it in that interpretation of my question.
Well, I guess I did. I thought I was trying to take it more metaphysical. I wasn't talking about attention. I was talking about like, and this is like a deep philosophical topic. It's the core of Brentano's work. It's Edmund Husserl. All of Edmund Husserl's phenomenology is about intentionality and about trying to understand intentionality. But maybe the problem is you're using this word different than I sort of understand it. So maybe I'm ignorant and I'm not properly responding to what you're saying. Perhaps you could give me a better idea of what you mean by intention and intentionality.
Like the way that I see it, it might be the driving moment that guides somebody. It's like, what is it that you do, and why is it? Well, it's the why. Why are you guided by? Well, what is it that you're guided by in that sense?
Oh, okay. So typically that question is asked under motivation, which is why are you doing it and what's guiding you in your behavior? And if that's what you're talking about, then again, there is a tremendous amount of work trying to understand what motivation is, how does it work, and also what's the relationship between motivation and acting and thinking on purpose. So again, there's a lot of work happening there. And then where that gets into some of the metaphysics is trying to understand what's the connection between something acting in motivation and just something happening as a self-organizing process. So a tornado is definitely self-organizing, but it's not motivated. And of course, a dog is clearly motivated. What do we say about a paramecium? It's clearly self-organizing, and it seems to be directing its behavior. Does it have motivation? These are questions people are wrestling with right now.
It is the spectrum. Are we just reacting to our emotions and that's it? And is it all predetermined essentially?
Well, I wouldn't say that. First of all, because I don't think your emotions are predetermined. But I mean, I do think that, and it's not just emotion. Emotion is emote. It's how your motivation turns into motion. Emotion, right? And so, what's the relationship between affect, motivation, emotion, and also the difference between the voluntary and the involuntary? And I don't mean free will, because I don't think that there is such a thing, but between the voluntary, the self-determining, and the involuntary, the impulsive expression of emotion. Yeah, this is stuff that's being very richly explored right now.
You've dropped some good words that I'm going to follow up with. And what were the name of those two characters you mentioned? Brentissimo and Husserl?
Brentano, but and then Brentano's most important disciple, Husserl, Husserl. He's the founder of phenomenology.
Okay, that's plenty of food for thought. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
And thank you, everyone, for the fantastic questions, and John, as always, for the insightful and engaging answers. This was great.
Well, as always, I really enjoyed being here tonight. But I always do. It's funny. I always know it's going to be good, but I'm always surprised by how good it is. And that sounds like a contradiction, but it's not. And so thank you very much.
Well, thanks, great. John.
Yeah,
hey, everyone.